Imagine discovering that the man you called father was also the father of your children, that the walls of your childhood home concealed a nightmare so twisted, authorities would later call it one of the most disturbing cases in American history. In the isolated farmlands of Missouri, a place where neighbors were miles apart and screams went unheard, one man created his own kingdom of horror. This isn't fiction. This isn't folklore. This is the true story of Colt Romulus, the farmer who turned his family into his harem, and the inbred nightmare that shocked a nation. What you're about to hear will make you question how such evil can hide in plain sight. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Before we descend into this darkness, if you're fascinated by true crime stories that expose the worst of humanity, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. These are the stories that need to be told, the ones that make us vigilant, the ones that remind us evil doesn't always announce itself. Now, let's enter the nightmare. The dirt road leading to the Romulus farm stretched for 3 miles through dense Missouri woodland, a winding path that seemed designed to keep the world out. It was 2004, and the property had been in the Romulus family for 4 generations. 200 acres of farmland bordered by thick forests that swallowed sound. The main house, a weathered two-story structure with peeling white paint, sat at the center of the property like a rotten tooth. Surrounding it were several smaller cabins, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, and fields that had long since stopped producing anything of value. Colt Romulus was 53 years old when authorities first received an anonymous call about the farm. Described by the few who knew him as a large man with calloused hands and eyes that never quite met yours, Colt had inherited the property from his father in 1987. His wife, Martha, had died in 1992 under circumstances that were never fully investigated, a fact that would later haunt the local sheriff's department. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. She was 31 years old. They had 5 children together, 3 daughters and 2 sons, ranging in age from 3 to 12 when Martha died. After Martha's death, Colt withdrew further from what little society he'd engaged with. The children stopped attending the local school, which Colt justified by claiming he was homeschooling them. In rural Missouri in the 90s, with an overwhelmed education system and a cultural respect for parental rights, no one pushed the issue. The family became ghosts, occasionally seen at the feed store or the grocery mart in the nearest town, 30 miles away, but never staying long, never making conversation. The children, locals would later recall, always looked down, always stayed close to their father, always left quickly. What happened on that farm over the next 12 years would only come to light because of a single act of desperation. In August 2004, a girl who appeared to be in her late teens stumbled into a gas station in Lebanon, Missouri, 27 miles from the Romulus property. She was barefoot, wearing a thin nightgown despite the afternoon hour, and her arms were covered in bruises in various stages of healing. When the clerk asked if she needed help, the girl began to sob. The clerk immediately called the police. The girl's name was Rebecca Romulus. She was 19 years old. She was Colt's oldest daughter, and she was 6 months pregnant with what she claimed was her 7th child. When investigators pressed her on the identity of the father, Rebecca broke down completely. Her father, she whispered, was the only man she had ever known. He was the father of all her children, and she wasn't the only one. The raid on the Romulus farm happened 3 days later at dawn with a team of 16 officers from 3 different counties. What they found inside the main house and the surrounding cabins would become the subject of psychiatric studies, legal debates, and national horror. The property was structured like a compound, with Colt's bedroom in the main house positioned centrally, and the smaller cabins housing his daughters and their children. The 2 sons, Mark and David, lived in a converted section of the barn and worked the farm under their father's supervision. Inside the main house, Investigators found extensive documentation of Colt's crimes, though he himself would never characterize them as such. There were journals dating back to 1993, a year after Martha's death, detailing what Colt described as his family education program. In these journals, written in cramped, meticulous handwriting, Colt outlined his belief that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, that the only pure form of life was one lived in complete isolation, and that his daughter's purpose was to continue the family bloodline under his guidance. The language was clinical, detached, as though he were documenting a scientific experiment rather than the systematic abuse of his own children. The oldest daughter, Rebecca, had given birth to her first child at 14. The second daughter, Sarah, was 17 and had 4 children. The youngest daughter, Emma, was 15 and pregnant with her second child. All of the children had been fathered by Colt. The 2 sons, Mark and David, both in their 20s, had been conditioned to see their father's actions as normal, even necessary. They helped maintain the isolation, driving to town for supplies, keeping the property secure, ensuring their sisters never left without supervision. The children born from these unions ranged in age from infant to 5 years old at the time of the raid. Medical examinations would reveal severe developmental issues across the board, the predictable result of repeated incestuous reproduction. Several children showed signs of physical deformities, cognitive impairments, and genetic disorders consistent with offspring born from immediate family members. One child, a 3-year-old boy, was blind and deaf. Another, a 4-year-old girl, had a severe cleft palate that had never received medical attention. None of the children had birth certificates. None had ever seen a doctor. As far as the state of Missouri was concerned, they didn't exist. The psychological manipulation that had kept this nightmare functioning for over a decade was perhaps even more disturbing than the physical abuse. Investigators later pieced together a pattern of control that began immediately after Martha's death. Colt had started slowly, with small boundary violations that gradually escalated. He convinced his daughters that the outside world would harm them, that they were special and different, that normal society couldn't understand their family's unique bond. He isolated them from all external information. There was no television, no radio, no books except those he approved. The homeschooling consisted primarily of basic literacy and mathematics, along with extensive religious instruction that Colt had twisted to justify his actions. By the time the girls reached puberty, they had been so thoroughly conditioned that the transition from daughter to wife seemed, in their fractured understanding, almost natural. Colt framed it as their destiny, their purpose, the reason they had been born. The religious framework he'd constructed painted him as a patriarch in the Old Testament tradition, blessed with the right to build his family as he saw fit. The girls had no framework for understanding that what was happening to them was abuse, because they had no reference point for normal family relationships. Rebecca's escape had been prompted by a single, crucial moment of clarity. During one of the rare trips to town, she had glimpsed through a store window a magazine cover showing a normal family, a mother, father, and children who all looked different from each other. Something about that image had broken through years of conditioning. She began to realize that families weren't supposed to look like hers, that children weren't supposed to have the same father as their mother. The realization grew over weeks until, one night when Colt was asleep, she walked out of her cabin and kept walking until she reached the main road, then followed it for hours until she found the gas station. The trial of Colt Romulus began in March 2005 and lasted 7 weeks. The prosecution brought forward a staggering list of charges: multiple counts of rape, incest, child abuse, endangerment, and unlawful imprisonment. The defense, appointed by the court after Colt insisted on representing himself and was deemed unfit to do so, attempted to argue diminished capacity and religious freedom. The religious freedom argument was dismantled within minutes. The diminished capacity claim fell apart under psychiatric evaluation, which revealed Colt to be of above-average intelligence and fully aware of societal norms, which he had consciously chosen to violate. The most harrowing moments of the trial came when Rebecca and Sarah testified. Both young women, now in protective custody and undergoing intensive therapy, took the stand to describe their experiences. Rebecca's testimony was methodical and detailed, as though she were recounting events that had happened to someone else. She described being 12 years old and having her father explain that she was becoming a woman, that this meant she had new responsibilities. She described the first assault at 13, how she had cried and been told it was necessary, that it was what God wanted. She described giving birth at 14 in a cabin with only her father's assistance, how the pain had been unbearable, how she had been certain she would die. Sarah's testimony was shorter, but no less devastating. She described growing up watching what happened to Rebecca, and knowing it would happen to her too. She described the resignation, the numb acceptance, the way she had trained herself to leave her body during the abuse, to think about clouds or trees or anything but what was happening. She described the confusion when her children were born, loving them desperately while understanding, on some level, that their very existence was wrong. The defense made the catastrophic mistake of calling Mark, one of the sons, as a witness. The prosecution had offered both sons immunity in exchange for testimony, which they had refused, standing by their father. On the stand, Mark defended Colt's actions, insisting that their family was special, that outsiders couldn't understand their bond, that his father had created a pure and righteous family unit. The jury's reaction was visible disgust. Whatever sympathy might have existed for the sons as victims of conditioning evaporated as Mark calmly explained that he saw nothing wrong with what had happened to his sisters. The medical testimony was clinical but horrifying. Geneticists explain the concept of coefficient of inbreeding, the statistical measure of how closely related the parents of an offspring are. Children born from parent-child incest have a coefficient of 25%, meaning 1/4 of their genetic material is identical by descent. This dramatically increases the probability of recessive genetic disorders emerging. The doctor who had examined the children testified about the specific conditions he had observed. Several had congenital heart defects, 2 showed signs of microcephaly, or abnormally small heads indicating brain development issues, and virtually all displayed some degree of developmental delay. Perhaps most disturbing was the testimony about the children's social and emotional development. Child psychologists explained that the children had no understanding of normal human relationships, no concept of boundaries, no ability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate physical contact. They had never played with other children, never attended school, never been exposed to any model of human interaction, except the deeply dysfunctional one within their immediate family. The prognosis for their recovery was described as uncertain at best. These children would require years, possibly lifetimes, of intensive therapy and support. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Colt Romulus was found guilty on all counts. During sentencing, the judge departed from the standard practice of maintaining judicial neutrality to deliver a scathing condemnation. He called Colt's actions a betrayal of everything parenthood represented, a systematic destruction of innocence, and a crime against nature itself. Colt was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion as the sentence was read, staring straight ahead with the same blank expression he had maintained throughout the trial. The aftermath of the Romulus case sent shockwaves through Missouri and beyond. It raised uncomfortable questions about how such a situation could persist for over a decade without intervention. Investigations revealed that Child Protective Services had received 2 anonymous calls about the family in the late 90s, both expressing concern about the children's absence from school. Both calls had resulted in case files being opened, but in both instances, Colt had met with investigators at the property entrance, provided documentation of his homeschooling curriculum, and denied entry to the property itself. The investigators, overworked in dealing with hundreds of cases, had accepted his explanations and closed the files. The local sheriff's department also came under scrutiny for their handling of Martha Romulus's death. Medical examiners reviewing the case file noted that the reported symptoms of heart failure were inconsistent with the autopsy findings, which were minimal. Several inconsistencies in Colt's statement about the timeline of her death were never investigated. While no charges were ever filed related to Martha's death due to lack of evidence and the passage of time, the implication was clear. Investigators believed Colt had likely killed his wife when she threatened to expose or stop his abuse of their daughters. Rebecca, Sarah, and Emma were placed in specialized foster care with families trained to handle severe trauma cases. The road to recovery was long and painful. All 3 women struggled with complex PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Rebecca, in particular, battled suicidal ideation for years. But slowly, with therapy and support, they began to build new lives. Rebecca eventually obtained her GED and enrolled in community college. Sarah found solace in art therapy, creating paintings that expressed the trauma she struggled to verbalize. Emma, the youngest, had the longest road ahead, but showed remarkable resilience. The children faced even greater challenges. Several required multiple surgeries to address their physical deformities. The cognitive and developmental delays ranged from mild to severe, requiring individualized education plans and ongoing therapy. Some would never be able to live independently. The state of Missouri established a trust fund to ensure these children would receive lifetime care and support. It was funded partially through the sale of the Romulus property, which was eventually purchased by a developer who demolished all the structures and subdivided the land. Mark and David, the sons, faced a different kind of reckoning. Though they were not charged with crimes, their defense of their father and complicity in maintaining the isolation made them pariahs. Both eventually underwent court-mandated therapy. David showed signs of genuine remorse and slowly began to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. He eventually reconciled with his sisters, though the relationship remained strained. Mark remained largely unrepentant, maintaining that the outside world had destroyed their family. He cut off all contact with his siblings and disappeared from public record sometime in 2008. The Romulus case led to significant changes in Missouri law. The state implemented stricter oversight of homeschooling, requiring regular evaluations and home visits. Mandatory reporting requirements for medical professionals, teachers, and social workers were strengthened. Training programs for Child Protective Services were overhauled to better identify and investigate potential abuse in isolated families. While these changes couldn't undo what had happened, they represented an attempt to ensure no family could fall through the cracks so completely again. Colt Romulus died in prison in 2019 at the age of 68 from complications related to diabetes. He never expressed remorse for his actions. In a final interview with a journalist conducted a year before his death, he maintained that he had been a good father who had protected his family from a corrupt world. He insisted that his daughters had been happy, that his grandchildren had been loved, and that the state had no right to interfere with his family. The journalist noted that Colt seemed genuinely baffled by the world's condemnation, as though he truly could not comprehend why his actions were viewed as monstrous. Rebecca Romulus, now in her late 30s, has become an advocate for abuse survivors. She gives occasional talks, always with her face obscured and using a pseudonym, about the nature of familial abuse and the long process of recovery. In one speech, she addressed the question she's asked most often: "How did you survive?" Her answer was simple but profound. She said that even in the darkest moments, some part of her knew that what was happening wasn't right, that the world wasn't supposed to be that way. That tiny kernel of knowledge, buried deep, kept her alive until the day she saw that magazine cover, and everything clicked into place. The case raises profound questions about the nature of evil and the vulnerability of children. How does a parent, someone biologically programmed to protect their offspring, become their abuser? Psychologists have studied Colt's background extensively, searching for answers. His own childhood was marked by severe abuse, though nothing approaching what he inflicted on his children. His father was an alcoholic who beat his children regularly. His mother was passive and withdrawn. But millions of people survive difficult childhoods without becoming monsters. Something in Colt's psychological makeup, whether innate or developed, allowed him to cross lines that most humans find instinctively abhorrent. The isolation factor cannot be understated. Humans are social creatures, and our morality is largely shaped and reinforced by our communities. When someone removes themselves entirely from social contact, when there are no external checks on behavior, when there is no one to say this is wrong, darkness can flourish. The Romulus farm became a kingdom unto itself, with Colt as absolute monarch, answerable to no one. In that isolation, his twisted belief system could develop unchecked, reinforced by the total control he wielded over his family. There's also the uncomfortable reality that this case, while extreme, is not unique. Familial abuse, incest, and the systematic control of family members occur more frequently than most people realize. The Romulus case gained national attention because of its extreme nature and the number of victims. But child protective services across the country deal with similar situations, if usually less severe, on a regular basis. The difference is often one of degree rather than kind. Isolation, control, manipulation, these are common features in abusive families. The Romulus case simply took these elements to their most horrific extreme. The children born from Colt's abuse, now teenagers and young adults, face an uncertain future. Some have been told the truth about their origins, while others, particularly those with severe cognitive impairments, have been given simplified explanations. The question of how to handle genetic testing and health monitoring for these individuals is complex. They are at elevated risk for certain genetic conditions due to their inbred status, but discussing this reality requires confronting the trauma of their origins. Medical ethics boards have debated the best approach, trying to balance the need for informed medical care with the psychological well-being of victims who have already suffered tremendously. In the years since the case broke, investigative journalists have attempted to trace back the Romulus family history, searching for patterns or warning signs. They discovered that isolation and insularity had been features of the family for generations. Colt's father had been similarly withdrawn, and his grandfather before him. The property had always been remote. The family had always kept to themselves. Whether earlier generations had engaged in similar abuse is unknown, but the pattern of isolation that enabled Colt's crimes had deep roots. The question of forgiveness is one that Rebecca and her sisters have grappled with constantly. Therapists encourage them to process their anger, to acknowledge the harm done to them, to place blame where it belonged, squarely on their father. But the psychological damage of being raised to love and obey the person who was simultaneously destroying you creates a confusing emotional landscape. All three women have described feeling guilty about their father's imprisonment, despite intellectually understanding he deserved punishment. Undoing decades of conditioning is a process that may never fully complete. The foster families who took in Rebecca, Sarah, and Emma deserve recognition for their courage and compassion. Taking in severely traumatized young adults, some of whom were pregnant or had young children of their own, required extraordinary commitment. These foster parents provided stability, patience, and unconditional support during the darkest periods of recovery. Several of the foster parents have maintained relationships with the women into adulthood, providing the parental figures that were stolen from them in childhood. True crime enthusiasts often focus on the perpetrator, trying to understand the psychology of evil. But the Romulus case demands that we focus equally on the survivors, on the strength it took to escape, to testify, to rebuild. Rebecca, walking for hours along that dark Missouri road, barefoot and pregnant, represents a kind of courage that defies easy description. Sarah, finding her voice to testify in court, speaking her truth to a room full of strangers. Emma, the youngest, who had known nothing but abuse for her entire life, choosing to believe her sisters when they told her another life was possible. These acts of courage deserve to be remembered as much as the crimes that necessitated them. The Romulus property stood empty for 2 years before it was finally demolished. During that time, it became an unofficial pilgrimage site for the morbidly curious people who wanted to see where such horror had occurred. The local sheriff's department had to post regular patrols to discourage trespassers. There was discussion of preserving one of the structures as a memorial or educational site, similar to how some concentration camps have been preserved. But ultimately, the decision was made to erase the physical evidence entirely. The land was deemed cursed by locals, and even after development, many of the subdivided lots struggled to sell. Colt's journals, the meticulous records of his crimes, were sealed by court order. Excerpts read during the trial were enough to convey their disturbing content. Psychologists who have reviewed them in full describe a man who was intelligent, organized, and utterly lacking in empathy. The journals contained no expressions of doubt or guilt, only clinical descriptions of his actions and philosophical justifications for them. They remain sealed to protect the privacy of the victims, and because, as one prosecutor noted, they serve no purpose except to give a monster a continued voice. The media coverage of the case was intense and often exploitative. Several publications were criticized for sensationalizing the story, focusing on the lurid details while giving little attention to the systemic failures that had allowed it to continue. Tabloids ran headlines like House of Horrors and The Incest Farm, treating the case as entertainment rather than tragedy. Ethical journalists pushed back, arguing for coverage that centered the victims and addressed the larger issues of child protection and abuse detection. Support groups for incest survivors reported a significant increase in calls following the publicity around the Romulus case. Many survivors reached out to say that the case had given them language for their own experiences or courage to come forward. The case served as a grim reminder that familial abuse, particularly incestuous abuse, remains dramatically underreported. Victims often don't recognize their situation as abuse, especially if it begins in childhood, or are too afraid or ashamed to seek help. The religious community in Missouri had mixed reactions to the case. Some denominations condemned Colt's twisted use of scripture to justify his actions, emphasizing that true faith promotes protection of children, not abuse. Others remained uncomfortably silent, perhaps worried about scrutiny of their own beliefs about parental authority and family structure. The case highlighted the danger of extreme religious views about family, particularly when combined with isolation from broader society. Educational experts have used the Romulus case as a cautionary tale in discussions about homeschooling regulations. While the vast majority of homeschooling families provide excellent education and care for their children, the Romulus case demonstrated how the homeschooling system can be exploited by abusive parents seeking to isolate their victims. Finding the balance between respecting parental rights and protecting children remains contentious, but most experts agree that some level of oversight is necessary. The long-term medical costs for the children born from incest are staggering. Beyond the initial surgeries and treatments, many will require lifetime care for conditions that are directly attributable to their genetic heritage. The state trust fund established for them is substantial, but whether it will be sufficient for decades of medical care remains uncertain. The case has been cited in medical ethics discussions about the true cost of child abuse, costs that extend far beyond the immediate trauma. Rebecca gave birth to her 7th child, a daughter, 3 months after escaping the farm. Pregnancy had been high risk due to her age, the incestuous nature of the conception, and the lack of prenatal care. Remarkably, the baby was born relatively healthy, with only minor health issues. Rebecca chose to place this child, along with her other 6 children, for adoption with families who understood their background and were prepared to provide the specialized care they would need. The decision was excruciating but practical. Rebecca was in no position to care for 7 children while dealing with her own trauma and recovery. The psychiatric community has extensively studied the Romulus case as an example of extreme coercive control. The level of psychological manipulation Colt employed represented a masterclass in abuse tactics. Isolation from outside information, creation of a false reality, use of religious authority, gradual normalization of inappropriate behavior, and punishment for any resistance. Understanding these tactics helps professionals identify and intervene in similar situations before they reach such extremes. In 2012, 8 years after the raid, a documentary crew attempted to interview Rebecca and her sisters for a film about the case. All 3 declined. Rebecca issued a statement explaining that while she supported education and awareness about familial abuse, she had no desire to relive her trauma for public consumption. She expressed frustration with society's appetite for true crime stories, noting that for her, this wasn't entertainment but her life. The documentary was eventually made without their participation, using court records and interviews with investigators, but was criticized for lacking the victim's perspective. The 2 sons, Mark and David, represent a challenging aspect of the case. Were they victims of their father's manipulation, conditioned from childhood to accept an abnormal and abusive family structure? Or were they complicit adults who enabled years of rape and abuse? The legal system ultimately decided they were not criminally liable, but the moral question remains murky. David's eventual acknowledgement of wrongdoing suggests that breaking free from such conditioning is possible. But Mark's continued defense of his father suggests that for some, the psychological damage is too deep to overcome. Child welfare advocates have pointed to the Romulus case as evidence for increased funding and resources for child protective services. The investigators who visited the farm in the 90s were overworked, underpaid, and managing impossibly large caseloads. With more resources, more thorough investigations might have been possible. But budget constraints are a reality in every state, and the question becomes, how many cases slip through the cracks because we, as a society, choose not to adequately fund child protection? The psychological concept of learned helplessness provides some framework for understanding how the daughters remained in their situation for so long, even after reaching adulthood. Learned helplessness occurs when someone is repeatedly subjected to an aversive stimulus they cannot escape. Eventually, they stop trying to escape even when escape becomes possible, having learned that resistance is futile. The daughters had been conditioned from early childhood to believe that their situation was inescapable, that the outside world was dangerous, that their only safety lay in obedience to their father. The genetic counselors who have worked with the adult children born from colts abuse face unique challenges. These individuals need to understand their elevated health risks, but providing that information requires discussing the incestuous nature of their conception. For those with cognitive impairments, conveying this information appropriately is even more complex. Genetic counselors have developed specialized approaches for these situations, balancing medical necessity with psychological sensitivity. In 2015, Rebecca published a memoir under a pseudonym, Walking Away: One Woman's Escape from a House of Horrors, became a bestseller and brought renewed attention to the case. Critics praised her courage and the unflinching honesty of her account. Rebecca donated all proceeds to organizations supporting abuse survivors. In interviews promoting the book, always with her face obscured, she emphasized that her goal was not to sensationalize her experience, but to help other survivors feel less alone and to educate the public about the realities of familial abuse. The Romulus case has been studied in law schools as an example of the challenges in prosecuting familial abuse cases. The emotional testimony, the complex family dynamics, the need to balance victim privacy with public trial requirements, all present unique challenges. The case is also cited in discussions about sentencing, with Colt's 15 consecutive life sentences representing the judicial system's attempt to convey the magnitude of his crimes, when even the maximum sentences seem inadequate. Emma, the youngest daughter, has chosen the most private path forward. Unlike her sisters, she has never given interviews or participated in public awareness campaigns. Those close to her say she is focused on building as normal a life as possible, which means leaving the past behind as much as she can. She completed her education, found employment, and has worked hard to create a stable, peaceful existence. Her desire for privacy is understandable and deserves respect. The question of nature versus nurture is starkly illustrated in the Romulus case. Colt's sons were raised in the same environment, subjected to the same twisted belief system, yet responded differently. David was eventually able to recognize the abuse and feel remorse. Mark was not. What accounts for this difference? Was there something inherent in their personalities that led to divergent outcomes? Or were there subtle differences in their experiences that we cannot see from outside? These questions fascinate psychologists but may ultimately be unanswerable. The local community where the Romulus farm was located has struggled with its association with the case. The small town's name became synonymous with one of America's worst incest cases. Tourism decreased, property values fell. Local leaders worked hard to rehabilitate the town's image, emphasizing its history and positive attributes. But for years after the case, residents reported being met with recognition and discomfort when they mentioned their hometown. In the years since the case, there have been several other high-profile cases of familial imprisonment and abuse discovered in the United States and abroad. The Fritzl case in Austria, where a father imprisoned his daughter in a basement for 24 years and fathered 7 children with her. The Turpin case in California, where parents imprisoned and abused their 13 children. Each case brings renewed attention to the Romulus case, with commentators drawing parallels and asking how such situations can persist undetected. The answer is always the same: isolation, control, and a society that doesn't look closely enough. The Romulus case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about family, privacy, and intervention. We value parental rights and family privacy, principles deeply embedded in American culture and law. But these values can create spaces where abuse flourishes unchecked. Finding the right balance, protecting children without creating an invasive surveillance state, remains one of society's great challenges. The Romulus case suggests that we have not yet found that balance. As this dark chapter of American crime fades into history, the survivors continue their journeys of healing. Rebecca, has become a mother figure to several of her biological children, who were adopted by families that have maintained contact and allowed her to be part of their lives. Sarah's art has been exhibited in galleries, powerful visual representations of trauma and survival. Emma lives quietly, building the normal life she was denied. The children born from abuse are growing up, some thriving against all odds, others struggling with the burden of their genetics and early trauma. Cold Romulus is dead, but the consequences of his actions will echo through generations. The genetic legacy of his crimes is written into the DNA of his grandchildren. The psychological legacy haunts his daughter's nightmares. The systemic legacy is visible in changed laws and policies. And the moral legacy challenges us to remain vigilant, to look out for isolated families, to take signs of abuse seriously, to remember that evil does not always announce itself, but sometimes hides behind farmhouse walls on lonely Missouri roads.